Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about boundaries, and I want to do it in two parts. Part 1, Part 2. Part 1, boundaries. Where would you say you start and stop and another person starts and stops? What belongs to them and what belongs to you? Emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, our thoughts, our ideas, our personal space. What's your opinion versus another person's opinion, and how does that other person's opinion influence your opinion? Boundaries can start off from being something quite simple, like ideas that are yours gets merged with ideas that are another person's, and there can be a happy marriage of that together, a bit of your idea, a bit of their idea, and something can work. But where there can be a problem is where boundaries are overstepped and violated. So the definition of a boundary would be something that's ring fencing something in, like a perimeter around something. And naturally, where you would have a perimeter around something, there's the chance of that being violated and breached. When a boundary is breached, it can cause the person who's had their boundary breached to feel uncomfortable, angered, upset, confused. Many different emotions can come from that. And the extent in which somebody's boundaries can be breached vary on a spectrum. It could be anything from maybe being in somebody's personal space and you bump into them, you step on their toe, there's a physical thing that's being, a line that's being crossed, right up until something way down the spectrum where it could be a complete physical violation. Somebody could have been assaulted, attacked, somebody's physically crossed the boundary and hurt another person. It can be done with words, insulting comments, various different ways somebody's boundaries can be broken. Boundaries can shape how you are treated, how you treat yourself, how you treat others, and how you allow other people to treat you. Understanding boundaries are a necessary part of growing up. It's an important part of childhood to understand what's yours and personal to you and what's another person's and personal to them, and to be able to be aware of when somebody crosses a boundary with you. So in childhood, this is something that can be instilled by how someone's parenting, the friends and the environment they keep, what they see, how they see other people keeping boundaries. A child can take that in like a sponge, and then that's how they can form and shape their boundaries. Boundaries can be manipulated and abused by others. People who are abusive cross boundaries, and they tend to seek out people whose boundaries they can cross, whose boundaries they can manipulate, how they can confuse that person and get over that boundary to get into that person's personal space, their personal world, and wield their power over another person. That's abuse. An example I can think of that comes to mind about boundaries being manipulated, that song Shaggy, It Wasn't Me. For example, in the song is saying that somebody's being caught cheating and they're telling the other person, no, it wasn't me. You didn't see me. It weren't me. In a sense, they would rather have the person who caught them cheating believe they're mad than to admit that it was them. And it shows how we are in society, that you would it's a popular fun pop song. It's a classic, but it promotes gaslighting basically, so that you can lie to another person, make them think they're mad that it wasn't you. That's a boundary violation, guys. And abusive people care very little for other people's personal boundaries. They feel they have a sense of entitlement and another person's boundaries don't matter. Which is why it's very important for somebody to understand their boundaries, what they are, and how to assert them. So when you are up against somebody who potentially could be abusive, who may be abusive, that you are aware when somebody's trying to push a boundary, so you can steer clear of that individual. When our boundaries get crossed, if it's done unintentionally by another person or they're not aware, it's important to speak up. If a friend's done something that's upset you, It'll be the test of your friendship to see if that's something you can bring up with that friend, to let them know, when you've done this thing, it upset me, I wasn't quite happy with it. Can we talk about it, clear the air, and let's move on? If your friend can take that kind of conversation, and if you have the ability to come with that level of assertiveness, it can be a really productive thing. It's not always easy, it can be quite difficult, but it's something to definitely work towards if that's something you haven't been able to do before. And when you have somebody who you have a really good connection with, those type of conversations are easier. There's a level of trust between you and them. You don't expect that they're going to blow up in your face with rage when you share your opinion. I like to look at boundaries in this way when I'm talking about them in regards to relationships, interpersonal relationships, and people that we have in our life. If you think of all the people you've ever known, whether they've been a relative, a neighbor, a school friend, an intimate partner, somebody you've met on the street, a complete stranger, all the people that you've interacted with in your life, to the stage that you're at now in your life, have you kept in touch with pretty much all of them? Are you friends with all of them? Another way of looking at it with exes, are you friends with all of your exes? I put it across this way because in those interactions with various different people in your life, no doubt you would have disagreed with stuff, things would have happened, dramas would have happened. It's rare that everybody you ever met in your life was smooth sailing. You would have witnessed certain behaviours, you may have acted in certain behaviours yourself. So it's rare that everything and everyone who you ever came across with was just fantastic to the point that you would want to keep them in your life to this very day. So the reason I say, for example, I use ex-partners as an example, an ex-boyfriend or an ex-girlfriend. If you have found that you are still in relationship with them all, has there ever been any deal-breaking behaviour? Do you have a standard of deal-breaking behaviours? Are there behaviours that one person could do that actually breaks the deal of a friendship? Now, that particular boundary can vary from people to people. People may have a very thick line drawn across a certain particular behaviour, and when another person does it, that's it. They're no longer going to be that person's friend. Whereas for another person, they may have a more permeable line, which is kind of a bit more like a perforated edge. It's bits of together and gaps, bits of together and gaps, bits of together and gaps. It's not as a solid and a strong line. So that's the way you can kind of indicate another person's boundaries. Where I've mentioned the example of ex-partners being friends with all your ex-partners, for some people that's great and they've had healthy relationships. For some people, it can be a habit of hanging on to ex-partners like a bit of a hoarder. They're hoarding. Do you need to keep in touch with everybody? Has all of them just been perfect? It's quite interesting when people don't apply the deal-breaking behaviour rule. Are they the ones who others should apply the deal-breaking behaviour rule to? It's just an interesting question. I've always wondered that. Deal-breaker behaviour, I think, is quite a useful thing. If you have an understanding of what you will not tolerate, if and when somebody does that thing and it's not tolerable to you, that should be an indicator that with your deal breaker behaviour ideas, that doesn't cut it. That person can't remain in your life. They've crossed the line and their behaviour has broke the deal of you and them being in a friendship, a relationship, whatever the ship is. The ship's going somewhere. A ship sails somewhere. Is the ship you're on going somewhere where you want it to go? With children, a good rule of thumb for boundaries is the underwear rule. Things that remain behind your underwear are private and personal to you. If somebody's trying to get past that boundary of the underwear, that person's trying to violate a boundary. There may be exceptions to the rule if, for example, there's some sort of medical examination and there's needed for some reason in that sense. But it's a pretty clear boundary that if somebody's doing something secretive, if somebody's doing something that doesn't sit right with you, if somebody's behaving in a way, one way when it's you and them, and in a very different way publicly, there's an issue of a boundary that's being violated there. Boundary violations can be that person who comes to talk to you like right here. I guess COVID social distancing kind of nip that in the bud a little bit, but it can be about personal space too. You might want your own personal space. Someone's crowding in on it, it might feel a little bit uncomfortable. A good barometer for boundaries, I'd say, is comfort level. Comfort and discomfort. People that make you feel comfortable around, and people you don't feel so comfortable around. Individuals you can't quite put your finger on what it is about them, but something about them makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. You can't quite figure it out. There's a chance there's a boundary being violated. There's a chance that you are not establishing a boundary. There's a chance that you have let a boundary slip, that you feel uncomfortable in speaking up about a boundary that's being crossed. With boundaries, there can be a grey area that seeps in for many different situations with boundaries, and this is where I've noticed it brings problems when clients talk about issues where their boundaries are grey, the grey area. This is what can bring about a lot of strife for people actually. They lose themselves. They can't quite form right from wrong. They know something's not right, but somebody's words may sound right, but their behavior isn't right, and they're on the receiving end of somebody like that, and it can feel quite discombobulating. So the grey area is where it can need a closer examination with the idea of establishing boundaries, because that grey area is where there may be more fluid boundaries or a need to put boundaries in place. When boundaries are rigid, it's worth noting, is it serving you? Some boundaries absolutely need to be rigid. Some boundaries can be very rigid to the detriment of the person that's establishing such as a rigid boundary. If you have a very clear-cut rule about lateness, for example, and somebody turns up a few minutes late and you immediately just lock them off, right, that's it, I want nothing more to do with you anymore. Have you given the person the chance to explain their reasons? I use lateness as an example, it's just an easy one to go to, it doesn't have to be lateness, but are there times where you cut off, you lock off more than you need to because of feeling that somebody's crossed the line with you, someone's crossed the boundary, so you completely just cut everything off? And in you cutting everything off, you actually have lost a few benefits that you were getting from that relationship. It's typical when we want to, when we've had enough of something, we want to push off away from something, chop something off, that there can be a tendency to chop off more than you need in just survival mode. But that boundary that you've asserted may be necessary, might need closer examination. Are you open to looking at it? And are you open to exploring your boundaries? I believe it was Malcolm X that said, "A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything." And I've always interpreted that as he's talking about boundaries and the rights. Obviously he was fighting for rights of the people, but you can really apply that to boundaries. If you're somebody who's going to be way easygoing and will let a lot of things slide, what do you really then stand up and fight for? What's deal breaker behavior for you? The more you grow and mature and develop and form a sense of boundaries, I'd say the better circle of friends and people around you should really have, because you should be around people that are more like-minded like you, that have got similar values. Boundaries and values are intrinsic. They come together. They're one in the same. Things you value, things you're willing to establish as this thing here is valuable to me. So therefore, I don't just treat it any old way. And when there's been somebody who's been able to get into that valuable part of you, what's happened that's made that happen? That's where you need to have a little bit of a look. Have a look, pause, think and reflect. Something happened. That boundary is being crossed. What was it in me that weakened that boundary? What was it that person was doing that softened me? I find clients have real confusion over boundaries when there's somebody they have a soft spot for. When you have a soft spot for somebody, those boundaries are easier to bend and be more flexible for. And this is where it can run the risk of, if the person who the other person has a soft spot for, if that person's manipulative or abusive in any way, they'll be aware that there's an opportunity to toy with another person's boundaries. So for today, I was just throwing some ideas out there, something to think about, something to ponder on. And what I'd like to come back with next time are the solutions on building boundaries and what we can do to strengthen our boundaries where they are weakened. Thank you for joining me today. Please remember to like and subscribe and hit the notification button so when I do more, you get to know.